want to ask you one thing. I hear those words a lot when I lead chapel for the wonderful children of our Good Shepherd School. And I've learned something over 3 years of doing that. It is never just one thing. It is usually more like 4 or 5. There is probably no logical connection between them, and it is going to take much longer than I expect for the child to get them out. And somehow I can't convince these 3 and 4-year-olds that we're on a really tight schedule with chapel. Because I've got to get one group out before the next group arrives. So over the years, I've learned a couple tricks from the teachers to help redirect preschoolers' attention, which for the record is not something they teach you how to do in seminary. But I bring this up this morning because I wonder if that's how Jesus felt when he heard James and John come up to him and say, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." I mean, that's not a good introduction to a conversation, is it? Whether the speaker is 4 or 40, you know you're probably not going to like what comes next. And immediately before James and John ask this question in Mark's Gospel, Jesus stands up, looks at his disciples, and tells them for the 3rd time that he is going to Jerusalem, and when he gets there, he will be handed over to the chief priests, and he will be put to death, and on the 3rd day, he will be raised again. And James and John's immediate response is to go and ask Jesus if, when he goes to Jerusalem and gets made king, he will make them the number 1 and number 2 assistants in the kingdom. Haven't they been listening? But let's not be too hard on James and John, because it's clear that the other disciples haven't been listening either. Mark tells us that they're upset that James and John asked this question. And based on everything that's gone before in Mark, we can safely assume that they're not upset because they think this question is so inappropriate at this moment, but that they're upset because they didn't think about asking for these positions first. In Mark's Gospel, the disciples never seem to get it right. And they don't get it right this morning. I can imagine Jesus sort of sighing and thinking to himself, "Don't you know that we're on a tight schedule? Only got so much time left with you, and this is what you're arguing about." But out loud, Mark tells us that Jesus said, "Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve." If this sounds familiar, it's because everything we've heard from Mark over the past 4 weeks has been leading up to this passage. It's another way of saying, the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. And we should ask ourselves, honestly, where am I in that line? Who have I served lately? Today is the first day of our God the Giver stewardship campaign. And for the next 6 weeks, we as a community will acknowledge that all of the many gifts and blessings that we have come from God. And in gratitude for these gifts, we will respond by offering our pledges of time, talent, and treasure. And each Sunday, for the next 6 Sundays, we're going to highlight one of those wonderful gifts we have at Good Shepherd. Those ministries and committees that make so many wonderful things happen. And it's really appropriate, given our gospel reading, that today we are highlighting our outreach ministries. Those ways that we reach out and serve the community around us. Because you know, the question is not if we're going to serve. It's a question of who we're going to serve. Will we as individuals and as a community reach out and bless others with the blessings that God has given us? Or will we hoard the blessings for ourselves? You can only do one and follow Jesus. And I don't think I need to remind you that Jesus just said that he came not to be served, but to serve. In fact, the author of Hebrews, in the passage we heard this morning, depicts Jesus' entire life in the days that he was in the flesh, that whole time, as an act of prayer and service, of Jesus interceding for the whole world and pouring out his life in acts of service to others. Now, I think you're all aware of this, but I am not Jesus. And neither are any of you. Now, I had a professor in seminary who was really fond of saying there's only one job description where your job was to save the whole world, and that job has already been taken, and it's not by you. You know, we can't live these perfectly selfless lives. We're humans, and we have legitimate needs. But that doesn't mean that we can't serve sometimes. No one is asking you this morning to sell all your possessions and give them to the poor. But just because we're not going to be perfect at serving others is no excuse not to go out and pick up a hammer with Habitat for Humanity. Or to bake one casserole for Our Daily Bread. To put together one Thanksgiving basket for the Assistance Center of Towson Churches. Or maybe sewing one quilt for a child in the hospital for Project Linus. Or spending one morning serving lunch at Paul's Place. Maybe you're called to help one family learn more about financial management to save them from the risk of becoming homeless with Neighbor to Neighbor. Or maybe you're called to help identify one person who needs a boost for our micro-lending committee. Maybe after that, next week, you could do one more thing. You see, the thing with God's good gifts is that they're only blessings when we use them to bless others. Being like Jesus, which is what we're called to do as Christians, means serving others. So who is God calling you to serve today? Amen.
Amen.